The temperature in Billings, Montana had not climbed above zero in 11 days. The Weather Service called it a historic cold event. The local news called it a once-in-a-generation freeze. The people who actually lived in Billings, the ones who worked with their hands and drove old trucks and paid their bills 2 weeks late, called it something much simpler. They called it survival. Nora Callahan called it Tuesday. She stood at the bus stop on Central Avenue at 7:14 in the evening, her breath coming out in thick white plumes that the wind immediately tore apart and scattered into nothing. The digital thermometer mounted above the First Montana Bank read negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind chill pushed that number into territory that the human body was simply never designed to inhabit. Nora had been standing at that bus stop for 19 minutes. She knew because she had been watching the bank thermometer the entire time. Not because she cared about the temperature, but because watching the red numbers gave her something to focus on, besides the fact that the number 14 bus was now 19 minutes late, and the cold was beginning to move through her heavy canvas work jacket in a way that felt less like discomfort and more like a slow, methodical invasion. She was 29 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall in her steel-toed work boots, with dark auburn hair pulled back under a wool knit cap and hands that were permanently stained at the knuckle creases with engine grease that no amount of industrial soap ever fully removed. Her face was the kind of face that people described as serious, not because she lacked warmth, but because she had learned early that warmth without armor was just an open wound. She had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes, and she carried both of those inheritances the way you carry things that matter carefully and at some cost. She worked at Ridgeline Garage on the south end of town, a mid-sized independent shop that handled everything from routine oil changes to full engine rebuilds. She had worked there for 6 years, starting as a lot attendant and working her way to lead mechanic through sheer stubbornness and an almost preternatural ability to diagnose engine problems by sound alone. Colt Briggs, who owned the shop and had owned it for 30 years before his knees gave out on him, had told her once that she had the best mechanical intuition he had ever seen in a person under 50. Nora had thanked him and gone back to work. She did not have time for compliments. She barely had time for meals. She worked 60 hours a week, sometimes 65. The overtime was not ambition. It was arithmetic. Her truck, a 2004 Dodge Ram with a rebuilt transmission and a heater that worked on a strictly voluntary basis, had died that morning in the shop parking lot at 6:47 a.m., which meant she had worked a 12-hour shift and then stood in the dark waiting for a bus that was clearly not coming. She should have called someone. She did not have many people to call. The people she might have called had drifted away over the past 3 years in the quiet, gradual way that people drift when someone they know becomes consumed by something that leaves no room for anything else. And what had consumed Nora Callahan for 3 years was debt, and the work required to service it, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being too tired to explain yourself to anyone. She reached into the deep pocket of her canvas jacket, and her fingers found the envelope before she wanted them to. She had been avoiding it all day the way you avoid pressing on a bruise, not because you have forgotten it is there, but because you are not yet ready to confirm how deep the damage goes. She pulled it out. The envelope was already crumpled from being shoved into her pocket that morning when she pulled it from her mailbox, and the return address in the upper left corner read, in clean corporate serif font, VOS Financial Services, 4400 Commerce Plaza, Denver, Colorado. She opened it in the wind, which was almost a physical act of defiance, given what the wind was doing to everything around her. The letter was a single page. She had received enough of them to read quickly. The relevant paragraph was the third one. It informed her in the careful language of people who caused harm for a living that due to a scheduled adjustment in the variable interest structure of her loan agreement, her monthly payment would be increasing by $217, effective the first of the following month. $217. She stood in the dark, in the cold, and did the math the way she always did it, automatically and without mercy, subtracting the new number from what remained after rent and utilities and groceries, and the minimum she needed to keep the lights on and her body functional enough to go back to work the next morning. The number she arrived at was not a number that left room for error. It was barely a number that left room for living. $140,000. That was what she owed Harrison Voss and his company. $140,000 she had borrowed 3 years ago when her mother, Margaret Callahan, had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and the insurance company had done what insurance companies do, which was find the precise language in her policy that allowed them to do almost nothing. The hospice care alone had cost $11,000 a month. Nora had done the math in her head, sitting in a plastic chair in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, and the math had been very clear about what she needed to do and what it would cost her for the rest of her foreseeable life. She had not hesitated. That was the thing she came back to on nights like this, standing in the cold with the letter in her hand. She had not hesitated even for a moment. She had signed the papers the following afternoon in an office downtown that smelled of new carpet and institutional optimism, and she had taken the money and paid for her mother's care, and she had never once in 3 years of servicing that debt regretted it. Her mother had died 14 months ago in a room with a window that faced a garden, with her hand in Nora's hand, which was what Nora had paid for. Not the medication, not the facility, not the staff. She had paid for the window in the garden and the hand-holding, and she would pay for it until she was 53 years old, if the current amortization schedule held, and longer than that, if Harrison Voss kept finding reasons to adjust his variable interest structure. She folded the letter back into the envelope and put it back in her pocket. The bus was not coming. She could feel that now with a certainty that had nothing to do with the schedule and everything to do with the particular silence of a city that had decided to stop functioning in the cold. She started walking. The route home from the bus stop to her apartment on the north side of Garrison Street was 2 miles in good weather. Tonight it was 2 miles of packed ice and wind that came off the high plains with nothing to stop it for 300 miles in any direction. She walked with her head down and her chin tucked into her collar and her hands balled into fists inside her gloves. The canvas jacket was a good jacket for Montana in October. For Montana in January at -22 degrees, it was a philosophical statement about optimism. The streetlights on Central Avenue threw long orange columns of light down through the blowing snow. Most of the storefronts were dark. A gas station on the corner of Fifth had its lights on and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said, "Warm up here," which Nora considered for a moment and then rejected because stopping would make the remaining mile and a half feel longer. And she had learned that about herself over 29 years, that she was better moving through hard things than pausing in the middle of them. Stopping gave the hard thing time to reorganize itself around you. Moving gave you the small temporary advantage of momentum. She turned off Central at the intersection with Garrison and cut south toward the alley that ran behind the old Pinnacle Strip Mall, a development from the 90s that had never quite succeeded, and now housed a nail salon, a tax preparation office, open only 3 months a year, and a shipping supply store that smelled permanently of cardboard and rubber bands. The alley shaved 4 blocks off her route. She had taken it dozens of times over 6 years of walking home from Ridgeline Garage in every variety of Montana weather. At this hour in this cold, it was completely deserted, which was exactly what she wanted. The alley was lit by a single working light mounted above the shipping supply store's loading dock, and the dumpsters along the back wall of the strip mall threw long shadows across the packed snow. The wind moved through the alley in gusts, picking up loose snow from the drifts along the base of the brick wall and scattering it in pale, shifting curtains. Nora walked with her eyes on the ground, watching for ice beneath the snow, navigating by the particular quality of compression under her boots that distinguished packed snow from the black ice hiding beneath it. She was halfway through the alley when she heard it. She stopped. It was a sound that did not belong to the wind or the cold or the mechanical complaint of the city contracting in the freeze. It was a human sound, thin and ragged and intermittent, like breath being drawn through a damaged instrument. She stood perfectly still and listened, and the sound came again from her left, from the deep shadow beside the second dumpster along the wall. Her first instinct, the instinct that 6 years of working late nights in a garage and walking home alone had built into something close to reflex, was to keep moving. Whatever was in that shadow was not her problem. Whatever trouble had found its way into this alley on this night had done so without her assistance or her invitation, and the fastest way to avoid becoming part of someone else's catastrophe was to move through the alley and out the other side and not look at what was in the dark. She stopped walking. She stood in the alley in the cold and she listened to that thin, ragged sound for about 4 seconds. Then she turned left and walked toward the dumpster. She almost missed this girl entirely. Lacey Rhodes was curled so tightly against the brick wall, so compressed into the smallest possible shape a human body could occupy, that she was nearly invisible in the shadow. She was 17 years old, though she looked younger in that moment, younger and more fragile than anything had a right to look in a place like this. She was wearing a denim jacket that might have been adequate for a cool fall afternoon, and a graphic t-shirt beneath it, and jeans that were soaked through at the knees with freezing slush. Her sneakers were canvas, her hands were bare. She had no hat. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Nora crouched down in front of her. The girl flinched backward into the brick wall with a speed that spoke of a body still trying to protect itself even as it was failing. Her eyes were open dark and very frightened, and they fixed on Nora with an expression that was equal parts relief and terror, the look of someone who has been hoping for rescue and dreading it simultaneously because rescue and danger have started to resemble each other after enough days on the run. "Hey," Nora said. She kept her voice low and even, the same voice she used when an engine was making a sound she did not yet understand. Calm and attentive, not alarmed. "My name is Nora. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl's teeth were chattering so hard that the sound of it was audible over the wind. Her whole body was shaking in the deep, involuntary way that meant the shivering reflex was still working, which was actually a mercy because it meant the final stage had not yet arrived. In the final stage, the shaking stopped. In the final stage, the body decided it had done everything it could and simply began to shut down in order like a building losing power floor by floor. The upper levels going dark first, then the middle, then finally the essential systems at the core. "Can't," the girl managed. The word came out fractured by the chattering. "Can't go back. He'll find me." "Who will find you?" The girl shook her head. A tear ran down her face and froze before it reached her jaw, catching the dim light from the loading dock like a small, cold jewel. "I'm not going to ask you to go back anywhere," Nora said. "I'm going to ask you to stay alive. Those are two different things. Can you stand up?" The girl looked at her. In the dim light from the loading dock, Nora could see the calculation happening behind those frightened eyes, the ancient, exhausted arithmetic of a person trying to determine whether the stranger in front of them is a threat or a lifeline, and how much it would cost to be wrong either way. It was the arithmetic of someone who had been doing it for a long time and had gotten some of the answers wrong. "I don't want the police," the girl whispered. "I'm not the police. No ambulance. If they run my name, he'll know exactly where I am. Please." Her voice cracked on the last word, a small, clean fracture that carried more weight than anything she had said before it. "Please, I'm begging you, just leave me alone and I'll be fine." Nora looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the blue lips and the soaked shoes and the bare hands that had gone from shaking to a strange, whirring stillness in the last 30 seconds. And she thought about the letter in her pocket and the bus that had not come and the long walk that was still ahead of her, and all the very practical reasons why none of this was her problem. She was a 29-year-old mechanic with $140,000 of debt and a fever building behind her eyes from 3 hours of standing in the cold. She was not equipped to be anyone's salvation tonight. "You won't be fine," Nora said. "You're not going to be fine if you stay here. You know that." The girl said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Nora reached up and unzipped her canvas work jacket. The cold came in immediately, punching through the flannel shirt underneath with a viciousness that made her breath seize in her chest. She pulled the jacket off and the wind hit her torso like a physical blow, cold so immediate and total that for a moment she could not tell where her body ended and the temperature began. She stepped forward and draped the jacket over the girl's shoulders, and she felt the girl go still under the weight of it. The way an animal goes still when something warm and solid is placed against it after a long time in the cold. The stillness of something that has been waiting for exactly this and did not know it was waiting until it arrived. Put your arms through, Nora said. Zip it all the way to your chin. The girl's hands were shaking too badly to manage the zipper. Nora did it for her, pulling the heavy brass tab all the way up until the collar covered the lower half of the girl's face. The jacket was big on her, made for Nora's frame, and it swallowed the girl completely, which was exactly what Nora wanted. More fabric, more insulation, more between that damaged body and the air that was working to finish what the last 6 days had started. Her own torso was already screaming. The flannel shirt was nothing against this. She could feel the cold beginning to work through it with the purposeful efficiency of something that had been doing this for a long time and knew exactly how it ended. She reached into the jacket's right chest pocket before she surrendered it entirely and found what she was looking for. 2 tens folded together the money she had been carrying as her lunch fund for the week. She pulled them out and pressed them into the girl's now covered hand. 3 blocks north on Grand Avenue, Nora said. Her teeth were beginning to do what the girls had been doing, and she controlled them through an act of will that took more effort than it should have. There's a diner called Hank's, open all night. You walk in, you order hot soup and black coffee, and you stay there as long as you need to. They don't turn people out in weather like this. The woman who works the overnight shift is named Darlene, and she has been keeping people alive in that booth since 1987. You understand me? The girl looked up at her. Her eyes above the jacket collar were wide and wet, and filled with something that Nora did not have an adequate word for, a look that was simultaneously the most grateful and the most heartbroken expression she had ever seen on a human face. The look of someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world and had just been proven wrong. "Why are you doing this?" the girl whispered. Nora was already standing up, already calculating. The apartment was 20 blocks away in a flannel shirt. She would need to run the first half of it at minimum. She would need to run most of it. "What's your name?" Nora asked. "Lacey." "You're going to be okay, Lacey. Walk to Hank's. Don't stop walking. Keep your hands in the pockets and your chin down, and don't stop for anything." She turned to go. "Voss," the girl said. Nora stopped. The word had come out entirely differently from everything else Lacey had said. Not fractured by cold or choked with fear or blurred by the exhausted confusion of a body that had been failing for hours. It was deliberate, placed with the careful precision of someone passing something important through a closing door using the last second of clarity before the door shuts completely. Nora turned back. "What? Voss?" Lacey's eyes were locked on hers with an intensity that did not belong to a hypothermic teenager in a dark alley. It belonged to someone much older, someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had just decided in this specific moment with this specific stranger to set it down. "Harrison Voss, don't trust him. He's not what he says he is. He's not a lender. He's a predator, and the people he works for, they're the same ones who did this to me." She stopped to pull air into lungs that were fighting her. "They're the reason I'm in this alley." The wind moved through the space between them. Nora stood very still. She thought about the envelope in her pocket, the clean corporate font, the return address in Denver, Voss Financial Services. She thought about the letter she had opened 20 minutes ago in the wind on Central Avenue, and the number $217, and the careful language of people who caused harm for a living. She thought about the kitchen drawer in her apartment, where she kept all the letters stacked in date order, a paper record of a weight she had been carrying for 3 years. She looked at the girl in her jacket. "What do you mean they're the reason you're in this alley?" Nora asked. "What did they do?" But Lacey had used the last of whatever reserve had driven that clarity. The effort of it had cost her something she could not afford. Her head dropped back against the brick wall, and her eyes went heavy with the particular exhausted surrender of a body that has been running on pure adrenaline for too long and has finally completely run out. She was not unconscious, but she was standing at the exact edge of it, and the edge was very close. "Hank's," Nora said, sharp, loud enough to cut through the fog. 3 blocks north, You stay on your feet until you get there. Look at me. Nod if you understand. Lacey's eyes found hers. She nodded. One slow, deliberate movement. Nora turned and ran. She ran because there was nothing else to do, and because standing still in a flannel shirt at -22 degrees was a choice, not a default. And she had not survived 29 years by making that particular choice. She ran with her arms crossed hard over her chest and her chin tucked down, and her boots hitting the packed snow in a rhythm that was less about speed than about the absolute commitment to not stopping. By the third block, her lungs were burning in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with cold air hitting tissue that was not built for it. By the sixth block, she could not feel her hands. By the 10th block, she could not feel her face, and a strange, spreading warmth had begun to move across her chest and shoulders that she recognized with the calm and distant part of her mind that was still functioning clearly. As one of the more dangerous lies the body tells itself when it has been in the cold too long. The warmth that was not warmth. The comfort that was not comfort. The body's last generous fiction before it started shutting things down. She ran harder. She hit the door of her apartment building at 8:43 in the evening, according to the clock in the lobby, which meant she had been outside in a flannel shirt for 26 minutes. She stood in the lobby with her hands shaking and her vision doing something it had never done before, a slow lateral swimming that she did not enjoy, and her lungs making a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the ordinary mechanics of breathing. A raw, rattling complaint. The sound of something interior that had been asked to do too much in too little time. She climbed the stairs to the third floor with one hand on the railing. She went into the bathroom and turned the shower on hot and stepped into it fully clothed, because somewhere in the back of her mind a voice that sounded like a health class from high school was saying something about rewarming too quickly in core temperature, and she ignored the voice on the grounds that she was standing in a hot shower in her work clothes. And whatever the theoretical concern was, it was less immediately dangerous than what had just happened to her torso in the last 26 minutes. The heat hit her hands first. She heard herself make a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, and was in fact something that had no clean name in the catalog of human expression, a sound of pure physical sensation, reclaiming a body that had come very close to letting go of the ability to feel anything at all. She stood in that shower for 20 minutes, until the water running off her clothes was no longer cold, and her hands had stopped shaking, and her lungs had stopped making the rattling sound, and the swimming in her vision had resolved itself back into the ordinary, reliable, single-version world. Then she climbed out, pulled off her soaked work clothes, changed into dry things, and sat on the edge of her bed with the envelope from Voss Financial in her hands. She looked at the return address for a long time. She thought about what Lacey had said, the precision of it, the way the name Voss had come out of her like something she had been told to remember and was determined to pass along regardless of what it cost her. He's not a lender, he's a predator. The people he works for are the reason I'm in this alley. She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what it meant or whether the girl in the alley had been lucid enough for the words to carry the weight they seemed to carry. She only knew that she was 29 years old and alone in a small apartment in Billings, Montana, with $140,000 of debt and a letter in her hands from a man whose name a dying girl in a dark alley had delivered like a warning. She put the letter in the kitchen drawer with all the others. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed about her mother's hands, the window in the hospice room that faced the garden, the way the morning light came through it in the last weeks, thin and gray and winter pale, and how her mother had said once that she liked the light even when it wasn't warm, because it proved the sun was still there, still doing its job even when you couldn't feel it. She woke at 3 in the morning with her chest rattling and a fever building behind her eyes. She lay in the dark and thought about Lacey. She thought about whether the girl had made it to her feet in that alley after Nora left, whether 3 blocks north on Grant Avenue had been close enough, whether the jacket had bought enough time, or whether the damage had already been done before Nora found her. She thought about what it cost a 17-year-old girl to press a name into a stranger's hand in the last seconds of clarity before the cold took everything. What kind of stubborn, deliberate courage that required. Because it had required something. It had not been accidental. The girl had held on to that name through whatever had brought her to that alley, and whatever days had preceded it, and she had held it specifically in order to pass it along, and that was not a small thing. She did not call anyone. She did not go back to the alley. There was nothing in the alley that would help either of them now. She got up the next morning with a fever of 101 and a chest that sounded like gravel shifting in a container when she breathed. And she called Colt Briggs and told him she wouldn't be in, which she had done exactly 3 times in 6 years. And each time the cost of it, the lost wages and the guilt of the unfinished work sitting in the bay had sat on her chest heavier than the illness itself. She went back to bed. She ate soup from a can and drank tea and took aspirin every 4 hours and watched the fever climb to 103 before it finally broke on the morning of the third day, leaving her feeling hollowed out and strangely clarified, the way a very high fever sometimes does when it passes, burning away everything that is not structural and leaving only what is essential. She lay in the clean aftermath of the fever and thought about her mother, who had gone through something much larger than a fever and had faced it with the same practical stubbornness she had brought to everything else in her life. Double shifts and phone calls every Sunday morning, and the particular unspoken kind of love that shows itself through showing up rather than through declaration. Her mother had been bad at saying certain things directly. She had been very good at being present. On the evening of the third day, the cold snap finally broke. The temperature climbed to 8 degrees above zero, which in context felt almost hospitable. Nora stood at her apartment window and looked at the gray, snow-laden city and thought about the 2 10s she had pressed into Lacey's hand. She thought about the brass zipper on her canvas jacket and the way the girl had gone still when the weight of it settled over her shoulders. She had heard nothing, no news report, no missing persons notification, nothing on the local news about a girl found in an alley, nothing that told her anything either way. She decided to decide it was good news. She had to decide something. The next morning, the fourth day, she pulled on her second jacket, a lighter fleece that was half the coat the canvas one was, and walked to the bus stop on Central Avenue. The number 14 bus came on time. She rode it south to the shop and walked into Ridgeline Garage at 7:53 in the morning and went directly to the bay where a Chevy Silverado with a blown-head gasket had been waiting for her since Tuesday. Colt was in the office with his coffee and his newspaper, which was how every morning at Ridgeline Garage had started for 30 years. He waved at her through the glass when she came in. She waved back. She pulled her hair up, snapped her coveralls over her work clothes, and rolled her creeper out from under the workbench where it lived. The shop smelled of motor oil and cold concrete and the particular metallic warmth of machinery that has been running for years in the same space. It was a smell she had grown up around. Her father had worked out of a 2-bay garage behind their house when she was a child, and Sunday afternoons, when she was 7 or 8 years old, she had sat on an overturned bucket and handed him tools and watched him work. And the smell of that garage had been the smell of competence and patience and the satisfaction of understanding exactly what was wrong with something and knowing how to fix it. She had chosen this work partly for that reason, though she would not have said so out loud to most people. She lay down on the creeper and rolled herself under the Silverado. The undercarriage was cold and dark and smelled of old oil and road salt, and the particular accumulated grime of a vehicle that had been doing real work in real Montana winters for the better part of a decade. She found where she had left off on Tuesday morning before the vibration in the floor had pulled her out from under it and changed the shape of the day entirely. She picked up the socket wrench and found the bolt she had been working toward and applied pressure. She was 30 minutes into it when she felt it, not heard it, felt it. A vibration in the concrete floor beneath her creeper, low and rhythmic and building from outside from the lot, coming in slow, deliberate waves through the concrete slab like something vast and organized moving in formation. She lay still and let the vibration travel up through the creeper board and into her back, and she thought for 2 or 3 seconds that it was a diesel rig pulling into the lot, one of the big ones, the kind of engine that announces itself through the ground before it announces itself through the air. Then the sound arrived. It came through the walls of the garage the way thunder comes through the walls of a house, not as a single event, but as an atmosphere. A total environmental condition, a sound that did not happen around you so much as it happened inside you. It was the synchronized roar of 12 heavy V-twin engines running in close formation, each one a distinct voice in a chord that had been built not for music, but for the specific, ancient, and entirely effective human purpose of communicating power to everyone within range of it. Nora rolled out from under the Silverado. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her shop rag, and looked through the large frosted bay windows at the front of the building. Through the distortion of the frosted glass, she could see them pulling into the lot. Dark shapes on dark machines moving with the unhurried, absolute precision of people who had never in their lives needed to hurry because the world had long since learned to wait for them. Nora! Colt's voice came from the office doorway behind her, tight and low, in a way she had never heard it in 6 years of working for him. Get in the back, right now. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the office doorway with his coffee mug in his hand, and his face the color of old concrete, a specific grayness that she had never seen on him before. In 30 years of running this shop, he had seen things. She knew that about him, the way you know things about people you work alongside long enough without ever discussing them directly. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was frightened now. Go, he said, through the parts room and out the side door. Do it now, Nora. The bay doors opened. They did not slam. They were pushed open steadily and with complete assurance by a man who moved as though the concept of a closed door was a minor misunderstanding he was generously choosing to overlook. He was enormous, 6 feet 4 inches tall, perhaps slightly more, with a chest that strained the seams of a heavy leather cut worn over a thick wool sweater, and a beard gone silver gray that covered the lower half of a face that had been built entirely along the lines of purpose rather than aesthetics. A deep, jagged scar ran from his left ear down the full length of his jaw and disappeared into the collar of his sweater, pale and old and permanent enough to have become simply a feature of the landscape of him, the way a ridgeline becomes a feature of a map. 4 men came through the door behind him. They arranged themselves without instruction, without looking at each other the way people arrange themselves when they have moved through spaces together for so long that the choreography has become instinct. The man in front stopped in the center of the bay, in his right hand held at his side with a casualness that was somehow more alarming than if he had raised it like a weapon was Nora's canvas work jacket. The sight of it hit her somewhere below the level of conscious thought. It was hers. She could see the grease stain on the left sleeve below the elbow where she had leaned into an engine block 2 winters ago, and the mark had refused to come fully out no matter what she used on it. She could see the worn patch on the right shoulder where the strap of her tool bag had rubbed the fabric thin over 6 years of daily contact. She knew that jacket the way she knew her own hands. The way you know things that have been part of your daily life long enough to become part of your sense of yourself. The man with the scar looked around the garage with eyes the color of a winter sky, pale and cold, and entirely empty of warmth, moving across the space with the systematic thoroughness of someone who was accustomed to evaluating environments for what they contained and what they lacked. "Who runs this shop?" he said. His voice was not loud. It carried through the garage the way cold carries by finding all the available space and filling it. Colt stepped forward. Whatever he was feeling, 65 years of living in this city had given him his own kind of pride about certain things, and one of those things was not backing down when he was standing on his own floor. "I do," he said. "Colt Briggs, can I help you, gentlemen?" It was not a question. He delivered it as one out of courtesy and nothing else. The man with the scar did not look at him. He held up the canvas jacket. "I'm looking for the person who gave this coat to a girl," he said, 3 nights ago, in an alley behind the Pinnacle Strip Mall on 4th Street. The garage went quiet in the specific way that a space goes quiet when the thing that has been dreaded finally arrives, and the period of dread is over, and what remains is only the fact of it. Nora looked at the jacket in his hand. She looked at the grease stain on the left sleeve and the worn patch on the right shoulder. And she thought about a girl with blue lips pressing a name through a closing door, and she thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer with all the others, and she thought about her mother's hands in the window that faced the garden. She set her shop rag down on the hood of the Silverado. She stepped out from behind the truck. "That's mine," she said. The man with the scar turned his pale eyes toward her. He looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something when what you find does not match what you expected, and something in his expression recalibrated the way a gauge needle recalibrates when the reading comes in different from the estimate. He crossed the floor in 4 strides and stopped less than 2 feet from her, close enough that she could smell cold leather and exhaust fumes, and something underneath both that was older and harder to identify. He looked down at her from his full height, and she looked back up at him, and neither of them looked away. "Your name," he said. "Nora Callahan." He was quiet for a moment. "Then my name is Warren Rhodes. My brothers call me Grip." He held up the jacket one more time, not like a weapon now, but like evidence, the way you hold up something that matters and let the weight of it speak before you do. "The girl you found in that alley," he said, and his voice changed on the word girl in a way that was almost imperceptible and completely unmistakable. A frequency shift, the sound of something enormous and dangerous being held under deliberate control by an act of sustained will. "That girl is my daughter." The words settled in the cold air of the garage and stayed there. It did not dissipate. It was heavy and specific and loaded with something that Nora recognized not as a threat, but as something more complicated than a threat. Something that had grief at its foundation and fury built over the grief, and underneath the fury, something that looked in the pale eyes of this enormous scarred man, very much like the specific terror of a parent who has come within 30 minutes of a world without their child in it. She had seen that combination before. She had seen it in the mirror 14 months ago, sitting in a plastic chair in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, doing arithmetic in her head. "Is she alive?" Nora asked. The question had not been what he expected. His jaw tightened. "She's alive," he said. "She's in the ICU at Billings General. Severe hypothermia. Frostbite damage to both feet." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "The doctors told me that if she had been exposed for another 30 minutes, her organs would have begun shutting down in sequence." Another pause longer. "The only reason she still has a pulse is because she was wearing this coat." He held the canvas jacket out toward Nora. She took it from him. The weight of it was familiar in her hands, the worn canvas and the heavy brass zipper, and the smell of engine oil that had lived in the fabric long enough to become part of it. She held it against her chest without putting it on. "Get your things," Grip said. Nora looked at him. "What?" "Your coat. Whatever else you need." His voice carried no inflection that suggested the instruction was optional or open to negotiation. "You're coming with us." Colt moved. For a man with bad knees and 65 years of accumulated physical caution, he moved with speed, stepping forward from the office doorway, with his coffee mug still in his hand and his chin up. "Now hold on a minute," he said. "You cannot walk in here and take my employee. That is not how this works." Grip turned his pale eyes toward Colt with the absolute minimal expenditure of energy that a man deploys when redirecting attention to something that does not concern him enough to constitute a real obstacle. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a gesture. He simply looked at Colt Briggs for 2 full seconds with those winter sky eyes, and Colt, to his credit, held the look for both of those seconds before something in 65 years of accumulated wisdom made the calculation that the situation required. He stepped back. Grip looked at Nora. "I'm not going to ask twice." Nora thought about the alley. She thought about Lacey's blue lips and the deliberate way she had placed that name in Nora's hands in the last seconds before the cold took the last of her clarity. She thought about the letter in the kitchen drawer. She thought about 30 minutes. 30 minutes less, and none of them would be standing in this garage having this conversation. She pulled on her canvas jacket and zipped it to her throat. "Let's go," she said. The van was parked behind the garage, which meant they had covered the exit before they came through the front, which told her something specific and useful about who these men were and how they thought about moving through the world. It was a black panel van with no windows in the rear compartment, and it smelled when she climbed into it of raw motor oil and cold iron, and the accumulated residue of many miles of highway in many kinds of weather. A metal bench ran along each side wall. She sat on the left. Two men sat across from her. One had a neck like a section of bridge cable tattooed from his collarbone to the underside of his jaw with black linework so dense it looked structural rather than decorative. The other had eyes that performed the very specific function of looking at Nora without registering her as a person, a skill that required considerable practice to develop and that she understood without needing to be told as its own kind of communication. Neither of them spoke. The van moved. Nora sat with her hands on her knees and her back straight against the cold metal wall and watched the frosted rear doors and listened to the road beneath the tires change character. The maintained asphalt of the city streets gave way to the faster, louder hum of the highway, and the highway eventually gave way to the slower, rougher crunch of a gravel road that the van turned onto after what her internal clock estimated was 45 minutes. She had been counting intersections and directional changes the way her father had taught her on long drives when she was a child sitting in the front seat making a game of it. He had called it dead reckoning. You always know where you are, he had told her, as long as you pay attention to where you've been. She paid attention. In the darkness of the van with the cold seeping through the metal walls and the two men across from her saying nothing, her mind went to what Lacey had said in the alley. The words had come back to her repeatedly over the 3 days of the fever surfacing through the heat and the rattling chest and the strange compressed dreams, always with the same quality of deliberateness, the same sense of something that had been carried carefully and set down with intention. Harrison Voss, don't trust him. He's not a lender, he's a predator. She had borrowed $140,000 from Voss Financial Services 3 years ago. She had signed 47 pages of loan documentation in an office that smelled of new carpet. She had made every monthly payment on time, every single one, even in the months when making it on time meant eating less or deferring something that needed to be fixed. She had received letters with variable interest adjustments, and she had absorbed each one and recalculated and kept going because the alternative was not a thing she was willing to consider. She had been doing all of that for 3 years. And a 17-year-old girl dying in an alley in a Montana blizzard had used the last of her lucidity to pass her that name like a warning. The van stopped. The rear doors opened. The winter light hit her. She climbed out and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the white brightness of a Montana afternoon, and looked at where they had brought her. The compound was substantial and intentional. Chain-link fencing, 10 feet high, ran the full perimeter topped with tight coils of razor wire that caught the winter sunlight in small, fierce points. Security cameras were mounted at every corner and at intervals along the fence line, their sweep patterns overlapping so that there was no angle of approach that was not covered. The main structure at the center of the compound was a warehouse built for permanence rather than appearance. Matte black exterior paint reinforced steel entry doors, and above those doors, a death's head rendered in paint at a scale that was clearly designed to be legible from a significant distance and understood immediately by anyone who saw it. The gravel lot was large and well-maintained. A row of motorcycles stood along the south wall of the building under fitted weather covers, their shapes unmistakable even under the canvas. 2 additional vehicles were parked near what appeared to be a secondary maintenance structure at the east end of the compound. The 2 men from the van flanked her and walked her to the steel doors without instruction or discussion. Inside was warm. After 3 days of low-grade fever and 4 days before that of cold that had worked itself into her bones and established residency, the warmth of the interior was almost aggressive. It hit her in a wall when the steel doors opened, heated air carrying the scent of leather and strong coffee and wood smoke from a fireplace visible at the far end of the space. And underneath all of that, the specific, layered density of a large number of people who spent significant amounts of time together in close quarters. She stood in the entry and let her eyes move through the space. It was enormous. The warehouse ceiling went up 30 feet, and the open floor plan was organized around a central area dominated by a table built from a section of oak that must have been 6 inches thick and 12 feet long. Its surface darkened and scarred with decades of use in ways that made it look less like furniture and more like a geological feature. Industrial light fixtures hung on chains from the ceiling. Neon beer signs provided supplemental light along the walls, their colors layered over everything in shades of red and blue and amber. The bar along the far wall was fully stocked and entirely serious about it. Along the east wall, motorcycles stood in a row with the deliberate, almost ceremonial precision of objects that hold genuine meaning to the people who maintain them. There were men throughout the space. Not a crowd, not chaos, but a population with its own internal geography. Somewhere between 40 and 60 people distributed through the room in the particular configuration of an organization that has been functioning long enough to have developed its own territories and hierarchies without needing to enforce them consciously. They registered her arrival, each of them, though not all of them, showed it the same way. Some looked directly at her and then away. Some continued what they were doing with a slight postural adjustment that indicated they were doing so by deliberate choice. At the oak table, already seated, already waiting, sat Sullivan Hatch. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair pulled straight back from his face and secured at the base of his neck with a leather cord. His beard was trimmed close and neat, which in this context was its own kind of statement about what kind of man he was. His eyes were dark and intelligent, and they moved over Nora with an attention that was thorough, without being hostile, the attention of a person trying to understand something rather than control it. His leather cut bore the president's patch above the left breast pocket. The other patches on his chest had accumulated over so many years that they had stopped being a list and had become a biography. "Sit down," he said. Nora sat across from him at the oak table. Grip moved to stand at Sullivan's left. His arms crossed, his pale eyes on her. The men who had come from the garage arranged themselves at the perimeter present without hovering. Sullivan leaned forward on his forearms and looked at her without speaking for a moment. It was not a performance. It was genuine assessment, the kind that takes time and does not apologize for taking it. "Nora Callahan," he said, 29 years old, lead mechanic at Ridgeline Garage 6 years. Before that, 2 years at Cascade Auto on the west side of Billings. Billings Technical College Automotive Systems program, partial scholarship, graduated in the top 5% of your class. He paused. "Your mother was Margaret Callahan. She died 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer stage 4 diagnosed 18 months before her death. She was 56 years old." He said his last sentence without emphasis or weight, which was more unsettling than if he had said it heavily, because it made clear that he was not using her mother's death as leverage. He was simply demonstrating that he knew it the way you demonstrate familiarity with a road, by driving it without checking the map. "You know how to do a background check," Nora said. "We know how to do what needs to be done," Sullivan said. "When this club incurs a debt, we find out exactly what we owe and to whom. We don't hand over money and call it square. We find out what a person actually needs, and we address that." He placed both palms flat on the scarred oak. "This club operates on a currency that has nothing to do with money. Respect and debt. When someone disrespects this patch, we collect the toll. When someone does right by this patch, we balance the scales." His eyes held hers without effort. 3 nights ago, you found Grip's daughter dying in an alley. You didn't know who she was. You didn't ask what kind of trouble she was in or whether helping her would cost you anything. You gave her the coat off your back in 22 below zero weather. You gave her your last $20, and then you ran 2 miles in a flannel shirt rather than take any of it back. Because of what you did, she is alive. Grip owes you his blood. When Grip owes someone his blood, this entire charter shares the debt." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do any of it to be owed anything." "I know," Sullivan said. "That's precisely why it counts." She looked at the grain of the old oak table, at the rings from 1,000 glasses, and the cuts and burns that had accumulated over decades into something that was less damaged than record. Then she looked back at Sullivan. "She said something to me," Nora said. "In the alley before I left her, she said a name." Nothing in the room moved. But the quality of the stillness shifted the way the air in a space shifts when everyone in it has just made the same decision to be very still. She said Harrison Voss, Nora said. She watched Sullivan's face. She said don't trust him. She said he's not a lender, he's a predator, and the people he works for are the ones who put her in that alley. Sullivan held her gaze for a long moment. He reached into his cut and produced a thick manila folder which he placed on the table between them. He did not open it. How much do you owe Voss Financial? He asked. The directness of it briefly reorganized her understanding of the conversation. $140,000, she said. I borrowed it 3 years ago when my mother's insurance company denied her hospice coverage. Sullivan nodded once, the slow and minimal nod of a man confirming something he already knew. He opened the folder and turned it to face her. Inside was a corporate registration document, dense with legal language, and 2 photographs. The first photograph showed a man she recognized from the letterhead image on Voss Financial's website. Mid-50s, square-jawed, well-dressed, photographed at what appeared to be a charity fundraiser. He was smiling the particular smile of someone who understood that maintaining the right image was more protective than any security system. The second photograph showed the same man in different clothes in a different setting, standing beside someone she did not recognize, and shaking his hand with the easy familiarity of people who had been doing business together for a long time. The man in the second photograph, Sullivan said, runs the distribution network for a cartel syndicate operating across 6 western states. They move product and they move money, and for the past 4 years they have been moving both through a network of financial service companies registered in Colorado and Nevada. He paused. Voss Financial Services is one of those companies. They don't just use these companies to launder money, they use them to identify specific individuals. People with significant debt and no good options and enough integrity that they won't do anything illegal on their own, but can be pressured into becoming useful in other ways. People they can leverage. Another pause. The same syndicate sent 2 men to find Lacey 10 days ago. She had gotten too close to information about their operation through a connection she should never have had. She ran. They followed her to Montana. Nora looked at the photograph of Harrison Voss at his charity function. She looked at his smile and thought about the 47 pages of loan documentation she had signed 3 years ago in an office that smelled of new carpet. The organization that ran Lacey out of Seattle into a blizzard, she said slowly, working through it, is the same organization that has been collecting my monthly payments for 3 years. Yes, Sullivan said. She sat with that for a moment. She let it move through her the way cold moves, not all at once, but finding the spaces between things and settling into them. What happened to Lacey? Nora asked. How did she end up in Billings? Grip spoke for the first time since they had sat down. His voice in the interior of the clubhouse was different from what it had been in the garage. Not softer, but less compressed, like something that had been held in a very confined space and had been given slightly more room. She's been living with her mother in Seattle for the past 2 years, he said. We have an arrangement that works adequately. It is not the arrangement I would have chosen. He stopped. His jaw tightened and then released. She had a boyfriend in Seattle, older than her. He had connections she didn't fully understand at first, and by the time she understood them well enough to want out the people connected to him, had decided she knew too much to simply walk away. So they sent someone after her. 2 men. She ran. She got on a bus and rode it as far as it went, and it stopped in Billings. His voice maintained its steadiness in the way that structural things maintain their steadiness when asked to bear more weight than they were built for, not through ease but through commitment. She had been on the street for 6 days. 6 days in January in Montana with the $20 she left Seattle with and a bag she lost on the 3rd day. When you found her, she was 20 minutes from the end of it, maybe 30. Nora thought about 6 days. She thought about a 17-year-old girl with $20 and no bag, finding ways to stay warm enough to keep moving and stay hidden enough to keep breathing for 6 consecutive January days in Billings, Montana. She thought about the discipline required to hold on to a name through all of that, and deliver it with that kind of precision at the last possible moment. She thought I should know about Voss, Nora said. She held on to that to tell me. Grip made a sound that was not quite a word. He looked toward the far wall of the clubhouse, and she watched the muscle move in his jaw under the scarred skin, and she understood without needing it, explained that he had been managing something for 72 straight hours, that did not have a clean outlet, and that the management was costing him more than he could afford to show in this room. She's going to be okay, Nora said. He looked back at her. The frostbite damage to her feet is permanent, he said. Nerve damage in both feet. She will walk with a cane for the rest of her life. The room absorbed that without comment. Sullivan closed the folder. He looked at Nora with those dark, intelligent eyes. 3 nights ago, he said, we received notification from a contact at Billings General that a young woman matching Lacey's description had been brought in by paramedics responding to a call from Hank's Diner on Grand Avenue. A waitress named Darlene called it in when Lacey lost consciousness in a booth approximately 40 minutes after she arrived. When the hospital ran her identification, our contact flagged it within the hour. Which is when you started looking for me, Nora said. Which is when we started looking for you, Grip confirmed. The coat had a name tag sewn into the collar. Your father's handwriting. Callahan in block letters on canvas twill tape. It took us 1 day to find the right Callahan in Billings. Nora had forgotten about the name tag. Her father had sewn canvas labels into all of his work gear 30 years ago, a habit carried over from years working construction sites where equipment moved around by itself if you did not mark it clearly. The jacket had been his before it was hers. The name tag was in his handwriting, the same deliberate block letters he used for everything built to last and meant to be read from a distance. What happened 2 nights ago? She asked. She looked at Sullivan directly. After you identified me, what did you do? Sullivan held her gaze. He was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to register as a deliberate pause rather than a natural one. We did what this club does when a debt needs settling and the terms require more than writing a check, he said. He reached under the table and set a thick manila envelope in front of her, larger and heavier than the folder. Open it. Nora pulled the envelope toward her and worked the metal clasp. She reached inside and pulled out a stack of documents. She recognized them. She recognized them the way you recognize things that have been present in your life long enough to become part of the furniture of your daily anxiety. The promissory note she had signed 3 years ago. The loan agreement with its 47 pages of variable interest language and subordination clauses and default provisions that a lawyer would have told her not to agree to if she had been able to afford a lawyer at the time. The personal guarantee, the payment schedule, the automatic withdrawal authorization, every document she had signed, and every document that had arrived from Voss Financial in the years since, pulled together into a complete record of the transaction that had defined the shape of her financial life for 3 years, and would have continued defining it for 20 more. Across every single page in heavy red ink applied by a stamp pressed hard enough to emboss the paper beneath was a single word. Nullified. Clipped to the front page was a separate document. A legal release of lien notarized signed in the handwriting she recognized from the signature block of 3 years of correspondence. Harrison Voss had signed a document stating that she owed him nothing, that the debt was fully satisfied, that all claims against her property, wages, and future earnings were permanently and irrevocably released. The signature was not confident. It was not the signature of a man comfortable with what he was doing. It was a signature of someone who had signed in conditions not of their own choosing. Nora looked at the documents for a long time. She looked at the nullified stamp on each page and at the notarized release and at the shaky signature she had seen confident and deliberate on so many letters over 3 years. She thought about what it would take to produce that particular quality of shakiness in a man who made his living behind the kind of smile that appeared in charity fundraiser photographs. She put the documents back in the envelope and set it on the table. She looked at Sullivan. $140,000, she said. Her voice was entirely steady, which surprised her. Gone. Harrison Voss has also relocated, Sullivan said. permanently. He has moved his operations to a different state and has been helped to understand that the territory he previously considered his is no longer available to him. The contacts he maintained in Montana have been similarly advised. You did all of this in one night, Nora said. We have had a relationship with this situation for longer than one night, Sullivan said. The connection between Voss Financial and the syndicate pursuing Lacey was something we became aware of approximately 6 months ago. We had been developing a proportional response. Your situation moved the timeline forward. He folded his hands on the table. When we understood what you had done in that alley, we had everything we needed to act. We acted. Nora was quiet. She thought about the letter she had opened in the wind on Central Avenue 4 nights ago. The clean corporate font and the number $217 and the careful language of people who caused damage for a living and had refined the language of it until it sounded almost neutral. She thought about the kitchen drawer with 3 years of those letters stacked in it, a paper record of a weight she had agreed to carry and had been carrying alone. And she thought about the drawer being empty now and what it meant for that weight to be lifted in a single night by men she had not known existed 72 hours ago. The relief that moved through her was enormous. She did not let it show on her face because the room was watching, and she was 29 years old in a room full of people who respected certain specific things, and one of the things they respected was someone who could absorb significant information without losing their composure. She understood that without being told. Her hands in her lap below the level of the table were not entirely steady. Grip shifted his weight. He reached into the pocket of his cut and produced a keyring. 3 brass keys on a yellow rubber tag, the edges worn smooth with years of daily handling. He set them on the table in front of Nora with a sound that was small in the large, warm room. Nora looked at them. She recognized the tag. She had seen it every working day for 6 years sitting in the same corner of Colt Briggs's desk behind the glass window that looked out over the bay. Colt kept his garage keys on a yellow rubber tag because his wife had given it to him 20 years ago as a practical joke, something bright, so he would stop misplacing his keys in the shop. And he had kept it because he was the kind of man who kept things given to him by people he loved. Colt Briggs accepted an offer for the full purchase of Ridgeline Garage this morning, Sullivan said. The property, the equipment, the business assets, and the client accounts. The offer was made in cash at a fair number, and he accepted it without hesitation. He has been talking about moving to Arizona for the better part of 3 years. His knees have been giving him serious trouble. As of this morning, he has the means to go. Nora looked at the yellow rubber tag with its worn edges. The title transfer is complete, Sullivan continued. The deed has been filed. Ridgeline Garage belongs to you free and clear. No mortgage, no lien, no encumbrance of any kind. He leaned back in his chair. The debt is gone, he said. The shop is yours. There are no conditions attached to either of those things except the ones we are about to discuss, which concern the standing arrangement between your business and this club going forward. Nora kept her eyes on the keys. She thought about Colt at his desk with his coffee and his newspaper every morning for 30 years. She thought about the way he waved at her through the glass when she came in without fail for 6 years. She thought about the yellow rubber tag and the woman who had given it to him as a joke, and the fact that he had kept it for 20 years because he was the kind of man who kept things. She looked up from the keys and met Sullivan's eyes across the scarred oak table. Tell me about the conditions, she said. Sullivan Hatch looked at her for a moment before he answered. Not the assessing look from earlier in the conversation. Something different. The look of a man who has been waiting for a specific question and is now measuring how much of the answer to give at once. Ridgeline Garage operates exactly as it always has, he said. You run it as you see fit. You set your rates, you hire who you want, you build your business. None of that changes. He turned the silver Zippo lighter in his right hand in the slow automatic rotation that suggested a habit old enough to be unconscious. What changes is this. When a brother breaks down on the road day or night, you respond. When we need a bay cleared for bikes that need to be off the street for a period, you clear it and you don't ask why. When someone comes to you wearing this patch and says they need work done quietly, you do it quietly and it stays quiet. He set the lighter flat on the table. In exchange, no one in this city or this state touches your business. No theft, no vandalism, no shakedown. No competitor decides to make your life difficult without making it difficult for this entire charter first. Anyone with a problem with Ridgeline Garage has a problem with us. In this part of Montana, that is not a small thing. Nora listened to all of it. She kept her face level and let the words settle the way she let unfamiliar engine sounds settle without rushing to classify them, without deciding what they meant before she had heard everything. When Sullivan finished, she nodded once. "I understand the arrangement," she said. "Good." Sullivan reached across the table and pushed the keys an inch closer to her. Nora did not pick them up. Sullivan noticed. Grip noticed. The room in its ambient and peripheral way noticed. "I'm not going to take the garage," Nora said. The silence that followed was different from any silence that had occupied that room since she arrived. Not the silence of waiting. The silence of something unexpected having already happened, and the room not yet having decided how to classify it. Grip moved first. He uncrossed his arms and took one step forward, and the quality of his presence in the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're refusing a gift from this club," he said. His voice was controlled in the specific way things are controlled when the effort required is significant. "I'm not refusing it," Nora said. She looked at him directly. "I'm telling you I can't accept it the way it's being offered." "Those are the same thing." "They're not." She kept her voice level, not challenging, not defensive. She was stating a position that she had arrived at honestly and that she was prepared to stand behind. "If I take that garage as a gift, I am in the same position I've been in for 3 years. I owe something I didn't earn, and I spend the next part of my life working to balance a ledger I didn't set up. I did that once. I did it because I had to and because my mother needed it, and I would do it again without hesitation. But I'm not going to take on that dynamic again for a reason that is not that necessary." She paused. "You said this club operates on respect and debt. That principle cuts in both directions. I cannot respect myself in that garage if I didn't earn it." Grip stared at her. Something moved in his jaw. "You did earn it," he said. "You earned it in an alley at negative 22 degrees when you took the coat off your back for a girl you had never seen before and knew nothing about." "That wasn't a transaction," Nora said. "That was just what you do." The words landed and stayed. Grip looked at her for a long time, and she held the look steadily because looking away from it would have communicated something she did not intend. Sullivan broke the silence. "Then what do you want?" he asked. No edge, just the question clean and direct. "I want to buy it," Nora said. "Not today, not with money I don't have, but I want a real arrangement, a payment structure, work and time and fair terms. The same deal any employer would offer to an employee who had been there 6 years and knew every system in the building and every client in the books." She looked at Sullivan. "I will accept the debt cancellation. I cannot repay that, and I know it, and I am not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. But the garage I will pay for over time. That's the only way I walk through that door every morning as the owner, instead of as someone who was handed something they didn't earn." Sullivan was quiet. He looked at Grip. Grip was looking at Nora with an expression that had moved away from controlled anger into something that did not have a single clean name. Something in the space between frustration and a different kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who has just heard a position they disagree with and cannot find a counter-argument they themselves would respect. Sullivan turned the Zippo in his hand once more and set it down. "You'll take the debt cancellation and we'll negotiate the garage separately," he said. "Yes. The debt is not negotiable. That's gone regardless. The debt is gone, and I understand that, and I'm grateful for it in ways I don't currently have adequate language for," Nora said. "I'm talking only about the garage." Sullivan looked at her steadily. "You understand that what you're proposing adds years of financial obligation. You'd be paying off a business while simultaneously running it, and meeting the standing arrangement with this club. I've been working under exactly that structure for 3 years, Nora said. I know how to do it. Something moved in Sullivan Hatch's face, subtle enough that she might have missed it if she had not been watching closely, and she had been watching closely since the moment she sat down. It was not quite a smile. It was the expression of a man who has asked a question he already knew the answer to and has now received confirmation. All right, Sullivan said. Grip made a sound, not agreement, not disagreement, something that existed in the space between them. We'll draw up terms, Sullivan continued. Fair market value for the property and business assets structured as a long-term work arrangement payable over time. The club holds the lien quietly until the balance is clear, at which point it converts to the standing arrangement we discussed. Bay availability and emergency response for brothers in the field. Agreed, Nora said. Sullivan nodded. He picked up the keys and held them out across the old oak. This time Nora took them. The brass was cold in her palm. 3 keys on a yellow rubber tag, with edges worn smooth by 20 years of Colt Briggs reaching for them every morning. She held them for a moment without closing her hand, feeling the weight, which was small and significant simultaneously, in the specific way the weight of things that actually matter tends to be. She closed her hand. The door at the far end of the clubhouse opened. She heard it before she saw it, the click of the latch, and then the particular shift in a room's quality when a new presence enters it, and she turned because something in the way the room changed made her turn, some collective reorientation in the attention of 40 people that moved like a compass needle finding north. Lacey Rhodes stood in the doorway. She was leaning on a wooden cane, her right hand gripping the handle with the intentional care of someone still learning to redistribute their weight through an unfamiliar instrument. She wore an oversized gray hoodie and jeans, and her feet were in soft-soled hospital slippers, because the nerve damage in both feet made anything with a firm sole a negotiation she was not yet winning. Her dark hair was clean and loose around her face. She was pale in the way that people are pale after serious illness, a pallor that was not just surface, but structural, as though the cold had taken something from the interior of her that her body had not yet fully replaced. Her eyes were clear. They were the same dark eyes that had looked at Nora over the collar of the canvas jacket in the alley, and they held the same quality Nora had registered, then the quality of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out with complete commitment, regardless of cost. The men between the door and the table moved without being asked. Not dramatically, just the quiet, instinctive redistribution of large bodies making space for something that mattered to them, the way water finds its way around a stone that has always been in the river. Lacey walked across the clubhouse floor. She moved slowly and with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been told to take it easy and has decided to take it easy on their own terms at whatever pace they choose, rather than the pace that caution would recommend. Chin level the cane, placed with each step, not as a performance of limitation, but as a tool used exactly as much as it needed to be used and no more. Sullivan caught Nora's eye before Lacey reached the table. She checked herself out of Billings General this morning against medical advice, he said quietly. She told the attending physician she had somewhere she needed to be. Lacey stopped in front of Nora. Nora stood up. They looked at each other. In the alley, there had been no real looking. There had been emergency and darkness in the ruthless arithmetic of survival. Nora had seen blue lips and frightened eyes, and a body in the process of failing, and she had not had time to see a person. Now she saw a person. 17 years old, with her father's jaw and her own eyes, and 6 days of Montana January carried somewhere inside her that would not go away, and a cane in her right hand, and something in her bearing that Nora recognized as the quality that remains after everything unnecessary has been burned away by something that was trying to finish you. Lacey reached into the front pocket of the hoodie and pulled out the canvas work jacket. It had been laundered. The fabric was clean, and the grease stain on the left sleeve was lighter than it had been worked at by someone who had put genuine effort into it without being able to eliminate it entirely, which was the nature of marks that had been there long enough to become part of the material. The brass zipper had been polished. The worn patch on the right shoulder where the tool bag strap had rubbed the fabric thin over 6 years of daily contact was exactly as it had always been. Unrepairable and permanent, a record of years of actual use. Lacey held it out. Nora took it. The weight was right. It was exactly right, the specific density of heavy canvas and dense fleece lining that she had felt on her shoulders every working day for as long as she could clearly remember, that her father had felt on his shoulders before that. She held it with both hands for a moment before she put it on. Lacey reached back into the hoodie pocket with her free hand and produced something smaller. A piece of fabric, perhaps 3 inches square, cut carefully with a border of hand stitching around its edges in dark thread. On the face of it, embroidered in small and even letters that had taken someone a long time to produce, were 2 words: Margaret Callahan. Nora looked at the square of fabric. She looked at the letters. She looked at her mother's name rendered in thread by someone else's hands at someone's patient. In specific request, her mother's name preserved in careful stitching, permanent and small and exactly right. "I asked one of the women here to do it," Lacey said. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the room. "She's very good. I told her the name and she did the rest." She paused. "I wanted her to be in it, your mom, because you gave me the coat, and the coat kept me alive, and I kept thinking about that in the hospital. That someone had loved you enough to leave you something that kept you warm, and you had loved someone else enough to pass it on when you needed it yourself." She stopped. "She should be in the coat, because she's the reason the coat exists, and the reason you're the kind of person who gives it away." Nora looked at the embroidered square of fabric. Margaret Callahan, her mother's name. 56 years old when she died in a room with a window that faced a garden with her daughter's hand in hers. Her mother, who had worked double shifts at a diner for 12 years to keep the lights on after Nora's father died. Her mother, who had called every Sunday morning without exception, and who had been bad at saying certain things directly and very good at saying them sideways. Through presence and consistency and the particular stubbornness of someone who decided what mattered to them and showed up for it without fanfare or announcement. Her mother, who had faced the last 18 months of her life with the same practical stubbornness she had brought to everything else, not without fear, but without letting the fear make the decisions. Her mother, whose name was now sewn into the lining of her father's coat. Nora felt something move through her chest. It moved fast and it moved deep, and she did not try to stop it or redirect it or compress it into something more manageable. She had been compressing things into more manageable shapes for 14 months, and she was tired of the compression, and this room with these people who operated on the currency of respect and debt and had apparently decided she was worth including in that economy seemed like an unlikely but sufficient place to stop. She cried, not with noise or theater, just her eyes which filled and overflowed, and her mouth which pressed together briefly before she let it relax, and her hands which held the square of embroidered fabric and stayed very still. Lacey watched her without looking away and without reaching for any of the standard things people reach for when they are uncomfortable with someone else's grief. She did not say it's okay. She did not say I'm sorry. She stood there with her cane and her clear eyes and let Nora be exactly where she was for as long as she needed to be there, which was perhaps 30 seconds, which was enough. Nora wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at Lacey. "Thank you," she said. "You saved my life," Lacey said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was a factual one delivered with the directness of someone who had had 3 days in a hospital bed to sit with the reality of it and had arrived at clarity about it. "I was 20 minutes from being finished in that alley. I know that. The doctors were explicit about it. You gave me your coat and your last $20, and you ran 2 miles in the cold without a coat, and you nearly died doing it." She paused. "I wanted to give you something back that was worth something. I can't give you the coat back more than it already is, but I can put her name in it." Nora looked down at the fabric in her hands and then back at Lacey. The girl was 17 years old and was standing in a Hells Angels clubhouse on a cane with permanent frostbite damage in both feet, and she had spent effort she could not afford in a hospital bed, arranging for a dead woman's name to be embroidered into a coat lining because it had seemed to her like the right thing to do. Nora thought about what it meant to come from a certain kind of person, how it showed up, how it persisted through things that should have stopped it. She looked at Grip. He was standing where he had been standing, arms no longer crossed at his sides now, and his pale eyes were on his daughter with an expression he was not managing into anything other than what it was, which was love of the specific, helpless, overwhelming variety that has nowhere adequate to put itself, and so simply exists openly at whatever cost to the exterior a man has spent decades constructing. Sullivan Hatch rose from the oak table. He moved to the center of the room, and the men distributed through the space, oriented toward him without being summoned through the long practice and shared habit of an organization that had been functioning according to its own logic for longer than most of its current members had been alive. He looked around the room. He did not raise his voice. Ridgeline Garage, he said, is from this day a friend of this club. The owner has our word and our cover. Anyone who puts a hand on that business puts a hand on this charter. He let that sit for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. The arrangement is what was discussed, terms to be formalized in the coming days. Bay access on request emergency response for brothers in the field quiet work when quiet work is needed. He paused. In exchange, everything this patch can provide in the way of protection, which in this part of Montana is not a small thing, stands behind Ridgeline Garage for as long as the arrangement holds. The room absorbed this in the way these men absorb things, not with applause or statement, but with a settling, a collective shift in the atmosphere, the sound of an organization absorbing a new fact and incorporating it into the structure of its understanding. Nora stood at the edge of the oak table with her canvas jacket in her hands and the embroidered square of fabric and the 3 brass keys on the yellow rubber tag, and she looked at Sullivan Hatch and nodded once. Sullivan nodded back. Grip crossed the floor. He moved with the deliberate, self-contained weight of a very large man who had learned to occupy space without apology. He stopped in front of Nora and looked at her for a moment, and then he reached out and put his right hand briefly on her shoulder, and then he pulled her into a half embrace, one arm across her shoulders, brief and complete, and carrying in its brevity everything this particular man was capable of expressing through physical contact, which was more than he could have expressed through any words he had available to him. She felt the cold leather of his cut against her face, and the solidity of him, and the faint exhaust smell that seemed constitutive of the man himself. And then he stepped back, and his face was its usual face, the scar and the pale eyes and the jaw. And he said nothing because he had already said what he needed to say, and anything further would only have diluted it. She put on the canvas jacket. The brass zipper ran up smoothly the way it always had, and the heavy fleece interior settled against her, and the warmth of it was immediate and complete, the warmth of insulation built to last through a decade of Montana winters, the warmth of a thing made by someone who understood that some things are worth making to last. The embroidered square of fabric went into the interior chest pocket where Lacey had pressed it. Margaret Callahan, her mother's name in the lining of her father's coat. Both of them together carried forward. She picked up the yellow rubber key tag from the table. She had worked at Ridgeline Garage for 6 years. She had arrived before dawn on mornings when starting a vehicle was an act of genuine optimism. She had diagnosed engines by sound in a freezing bay and rebuilt transmissions that other shops had given up on, and told clients the truth about what their vehicles needed, even when the truth was expensive. She had built the real value of that shop, which was not the equipment or the property, but the trust of the people who brought their vehicles there because they knew someone would deal honestly with them. She had done all of that for 6 years as an employee who was good at her work and showed up for it completely. She would do it now as the owner. The same work, the same hours, the same grease in the knuckle creases that no industrial soap fully removed. The same engine sounds cataloged in whatever part of her mind handled that particular archive. The same early mornings, and the same clients, and the same satisfaction of a diagnosis confirmed, and a repair completed, and a vehicle returned to the person who depended on it. The keys in her hand were the difference. Sullivan walked her to the steel doors himself. Lacey walked beside her for a few steps and then stopped because the distance to the doors was getting ambitious for her current relationship with the cane, and Nora looked back at her. "Take care of yourself. Nora said. I will, Lacey said. Come back sometime. Not for the arrangement. Just come back. Nora looked at her. I will, she said, and meant it. At the steel doors, Sullivan stopped. One more thing, he said. She waited. Your truck, he said. The Dodge Ram in the Ridgeline lot. We had one of our mechanics look at it yesterday evening. The fuel injection control module has failed. Straightforward replacement. The part has been ordered and arrives Thursday morning. He paused. The labor is covered. Consider it a professional courtesy. Nora looked at him. You had someone look at my truck. We had someone look at your truck, Sullivan confirmed with the exact same phrasing. She assessed the available arguments against accepting this and found none that would survive contact with the current reality of her situation and the current reality of the man in front of her. Thank you, she said. Sullivan Hatch held the door and the cold air moved in from the Montana foothills, and she stepped through it. The compound in late afternoon light was different from what it had been when she arrived. The winter sun had dropped toward the western ridgeline and was coming across the snow at a low angle that made every surface sharp-edged, in high contrast, each shadow a clean dark line, each lit surface throwing back the light with the particular intensity of snow in winter sun. The motorcycles along the south wall were still under their canvas covers. The cameras continued their sweep of the perimeter. The razor wire caught the low light in small, fierce points along the top of the fencing. A truck was waiting. Not the panel van. A crew cab with an equipment rack in the bed and a Hells Angels decal on the rear window, faded and deliberate. The man behind the wheel was the one with the bridge cable neck and the dense black linework, and he drove her back to the city in the same silence he had maintained throughout, which she had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but simply economy. A man who had determined at some point that words were a finite resource and spent accordingly. He dropped her at Ridgeline Garage at 4:17 in the afternoon. The shop was empty and dark. Colt had closed it when the Angels came through that morning and had not returned, which made sense. She unlocked the bay doors with her keys, the brass keys on the yellow rubber tag, and stood in the open doorway for a moment and looked at the interior. The Silverado with the blown head gasket was still in the second bay, exactly where she had left it when she had rolled out from under it that morning to find 12 motorcycles pulling into her lot. The fluorescent lights came to life when she hit the switch, humming and flickering for a moment before settling into their steady, even illumination. The smell of the shop rose around her, motor oil and cold concrete, and the metallic warmth of machinery that had been running in this space for 30 years. Everything about the physical space was identical to what it had been this morning. The keys in her hand were different. She walked to her workbench and set the manila envelope with the nullified documents carefully on the upper shelf where it would be safe. She set the Voss financial letter from 4 nights ago beside it. She looked at them both for a moment. Then she walked to the second bay and crouched beside the Silverado and looked at what she had been in the middle of when the vibration in the floor had pulled her out. The head gasket job was a 2-day repair minimum. The customer had been waiting since Tuesday. She was not going to leave it waiting through Thursday as well. She reached for her creeper and pulled it out and lay down on it and rolled herself under the Silverado. The undercarriage was dark and close and smelled of old oil and road salt, and she was on her back in the position she had occupied 10,000 times over 6 years of doing this work, looking up at the mechanical interior of a vehicle that needed something specific from her that she was qualified to provide. She found the bolt she had been working toward that morning. She picked up her socket wrench and applied pressure. The bolt gave. She worked until 7 in the evening, until the temperature in the bay had dropped enough to make the work impractical, and the light outside the shop windows had gone from pale gray to full dark. She cleaned her tools methodically, wiped down the surfaces, checked the locks on the parts storage, and turned off the fluorescent lights. She stood in the dark garage for a moment before she pulled the bay doors shut. She locked them with her keys. The walk home was 2 miles, the same route she had walked 4 nights ago down Central Avenue and north on Garrison. She passed the bus stop where the number 14 bus had failed to appear. She passed the mouth of the alley that ran behind the Pinnacle Strip Mall. She stopped. She stood at the mouth of the alley and looked into it. The single working light above the shipping supply store's loading dock threw its column of yellow light down across the dumpsters and the packed snow. The space was still and empty. The wind moved through it and lifted a thin curtain of snow from the top of the nearest dumpster and scattered it across the ground. She stood there for a long moment. She thought about what this alley had been 4 nights ago and what it was now. A place where something had happened. The same brick walls and the same dumpsters and the same inadequate light, and something had happened here that had changed the shape of several lives, including her own, and the alley had no record of it and never would. She thought about Lacey Rhodes, who had survived 6 days in a Montana January on $20 in pure stubbornness and the determination to not be finished before she had passed along what she was carrying. Who had held on to a name through everything and delivered it with precision in the last seconds of available clarity. She thought about her mother, who had faced 18 months of the thing that was going to end her with the same practical stubbornness she had brought to double shifts and Sunday phone calls and all the other things she had decided mattered. Who had been bad at saying things directly and very good at showing up. Who had left behind a coat and a name that was now sewn into the coat's lining carried forward. She thought about her father, who had sewn a canvas name tag into the collar of a work jacket 30 years ago to keep it from walking off a job site, and who had in doing so, through a chain of events that no reasonable person could have anticipated or designed, given a Hells Angels enforcer the means to identify a mechanic in a garage on the south side of Billings. She turned and walked north on Garrison. She walked through the dark and the cold with her hands in her pockets and her chin down and her boots on the packed snow, and the canvas jacket was warm against her, completely and immediately warm, the way a thing is warm when it was made to be and has been for a long time. She thought about what she would do with the money she had been paying to Voss Financial every month for 3 years. The number was specific. She knew it exactly. She had a clear sense of what it could do over the time it would have continued to be gone. She thought about Thursday when the part would arrive and the truck would run again. She thought about Friday morning when she would drive to Ridgeline Garage and unlock the bay doors with her keys and turn on the fluorescent lights and pull her coveralls on and finish the head gasket job that had been waiting since Tuesday because the customer needed their truck back and the work was not going to do itself. She thought about the terms she would work out with Sullivan Hatch in the coming days. Fair market value paid over time and work and money and the standing arrangement that came with it. She had been building that business for 6 years without owning it. She understood what it was and what it was worth and what it would take to run it well. She would run it well. That was not in question. The apartment building appeared at the end of Garrison Street. She climbed the steps and went inside and up to the 3rd floor. She unlocked her door and went into the kitchen and opened the drawer. Empty. The drawer where she had kept 3 years of correspondence from Voss Financial, the monthly statements and interest adjustment letters and payment confirmations stacked in date order, was empty. She had left the nullified documents on the shelf at the garage. The drawer held nothing. She stood there and looked at the empty drawer for a moment. Then she closed it. She took off the canvas jacket and hung it on the hook by the door, which was where it had always lived, the specific hook her father had installed when she was a child, because he said a coat needed a place to live, the same as anything else. She stood in the hallway and looked at it hanging there, familiar and worn and carrying its years. Her mother's name was in the lining. Her father's name tag was in the collar. Both of them in the fabric of it, carried forward by the act of wearing it, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and also in the specific way that ordinary things sometimes are exactly enough. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. While the water heated, she sat at the kitchen table with the 3 brass keys in her palm and looked at the yellow rubber tag with its worn edges and thought about Colt Briggs waving at her through the office glass every morning for 6 years, the same wave reliable as the smell of the shop and the sound of the fluorescent lights coming on. She hoped he got to Arizona before the spring. She hoped his knees gave him some relief in the warmth. She thought she might call him in a few weeks, when he had had time to settle, and tell him the shop was in good hands. The kettle began to sound. She closed her fingers around the keys and got up to make the tea.